Hello dear students and welcome back to our discussion on modern Indian history. Guys, the British had come to India from a very far distance, more than 20,000 nautical miles. Their religion, race, culture, language, everything was different. Yet, not only were they able to establish their rule, but were also successful in perpetuating it. There's an old saying in English, guys. Give the devil his due. One thing is for sure, that the British were able to develop efficient instruments for perpetuation of their rule, and consequently they lasted so long. In our discussion today, we are going to discuss about these same pillars of British rule here in India. The civil services, the army, the police and the judicial services were the important pillars on which the British Raj stood tall and firm. Our discussion today revolves around the evolution of these services. Thus far in our discussion, we have already reached up to mid-19th century, having discussed Lord Dalhousie in one of the previous classes. With revolt of 1857, there will be a threshold in the British rule here in India. The British rule after revolt of 1857 will unleash many new and different types of forces. So before we get into that second innings, so to speak, of British rule in India, this is an opportune moment where we try to understand the evolution of these pillars of British administration in our country. So let's dive in and get started. And by the way, towards the end, we are also going to discuss some of the previous year's questions asked on the topics that we have discussed thus far. So stay with me till the end to see whether you are able to answer those questions or no. Broadly speaking, the British administration had two important functions. Number one was maintenance of law and order. Maintaining of law and order is very crucial for any state and especially a colonial one. The colonial state's intent is to exploit the resources of the colony. And for doing that successfully, there is a need for maintaining constant law and order. Peace has to always be there. In the absence of peace, this exploitation is not possible. And therefore, that is the first goal of British rule here in India, maintaining law and order. The second is, of course, the continuation and perpetuation of this rule. Now, British rule in India faced many different types of threats. There were external threats in the form of French and Russian empires trying to impinge on their rule here in India. We have seen how the French were a great threat in the 18th century and early part of 19th century also. We have also discussed how the rising Russian Empire was viewed with great suspicion by the British as it was advancing towards Central Asia and Afghanistan. So the Britishers were always wary about these type of external threats. But this was not to say that there weren't any internal threats. In fact, there were many. Every now and then, there used to be movements, uprisings by civilians, tribals, peasants, and deposed Rajas, Nawabs, etc. against the British rule. The British rule had to constantly keep on dousing these small fires that were being lit in different parts of the Indian subcontinent. So constantly they are at threat because of this. So the administrative system of the Britishers is basically geared for these two roles: maintaining law and order so that peace is there and revenue exploitation, resource exploitation is efficiently possible. And second is to constantly douse these fires, the threats that the empire faces, so that the rule can be perpetuated. For this reason, they have, in the first place, the civil services. Now let us see the evolution of civil services in India. The evolution of civil services has or should be traced back from the company's times itself before it assumes political character. Only then we can understand the contrast. During the company's period, the primary role of East India Company was trade. And this trade was carried out by officials who were called as factors. What are they called? They're called as factors. And from this term itself is derived the term factory. So factors were in charge of factories. What were these factors doing? They were carrying out trade on behalf of the company or for the company. Their role was to buy the stuff from India's markets in the hinterland areas and sell British stuff wherever possible. This is the role of the factors. These factors, therefore, did not have any politico-administrative role because the company itself is not in that phase as yet. The company is just a trading entity. These factors were employed on quite low wages. The wages were low, but they were allowed to indulge in private trade. They could practice private trade, and this private trade was a supplementary income, which in fact many a times was more than their wages. And that is what kept the factors happy. So for a long period of time within the company's ecosystem, this idea had evolved that the company's officials will be paid low, but they can supplement their income through private trade. So they like piggyback on the company's trade. This was a culture system that had become rooted in the East India Company. Now, it so turns out that East India Company transforms from being just a trading company to having the Diwani rights of the most prosperous province of India, Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. Now, apart from these Diwani rights, slowly the company will also start to have an administrative role as Warren Hastings will take over in 1772. Now, this created a system where the company's officials were actually not very suited for this new type of role. Why was so? Because the company's officials were used to these kind of ideas. They had not really been trained, equipped for the new type of role which required very different mindset and skill set. Consequently, we see that during this period, there will be constant abuse of dastaks, which we have discussed in our topic of Anglo-Bengal Wars. The factors of the company will oppress Indians like the weavers, merchants, zamindars, artisans. They will constantly ask them to pay them bribes, give them gifts, so on and so forth. Now, this soiled the reputation of East India Company. It led to a lot of chaos and ruin in Bengal. East India Company slowly became one of the most corrupt entities in terms of all the trading companies who had ever come here. Warren Hastings becomes the Governor General in 1772 and is determined to resolve this particular problem. He takes some steps such as stopping private trade, stopping the use of dastak, so on and so forth. But the rot was so deep that Warren Hastings could not resolve it fully. Moreover, Warren Hastings himself was from within the EIC system, and therefore he did not have sufficient leverage to end something that had become so very well entrenched. Consequently, the civil servant of East India Company, as we see here at this moment, is corrupt, is inefficient, is exploitative. This had to change, and this will change with the arrival of Lord Cornwallis. After Warren Hastings resigned, Lord Cornwallis was sent to India with this very specific mandate of putting the house of East India Company in order. A man known for his discipline, integrity, and uprightness. He was from outside the EIC ecosystem and therefore was very ideally suited for this role. He recognized the problems of the civil servants of EIC and tried to address them holistically. What does he do? As he's called a father of civil services for the reforms that he implemented, let us see what he is going to do now. He reformed and modernized the civil services by making them professional civil servants. He creates a cadre of professional civil servants. How does he do that? Number one, he structurizes the civil services first. He introduced the distinction of covenanted and non-covenanted civil servants. Covenanted civil servants were the ones who were having important positions and these posts were reserved for Europeans only. Only Europeans could occupy these posts. A civil servant who's drawing a salary of 500 pounds or more per annum compulsorily had to be a European. Non-covenanted ones were lower officials who could also include Indians. So in this manner, he creates gradation. Cornwallis realized that the salaries of civil servants in company is very low, and that often compels them to resort to underhand means of corruption and bribery. So to solve this problem holistically, he raised the salaries of EIC officials, and thereby now the honest ones did not have any reasons to do corruption. So he gave sufficient financial incentive for the civil servants to refrain from taking bribes and accepting gifts. With this, civil service in India, East India Company Civil Services, became the highest paid service in the whole world. A collector back then could draw a salary of rupees 1500, which was quite a princely sum for those days for a person employed in some service. Moreover, he also had 1% share in the revenue that he collected. That's why it was a very lucrative kind of a job. Strictly, they were prohibited from accepting bribes and presents in return of this. So you've got good salary, now you can't accept bribes and presents. Private trade was completely stopped. Seniority-based promotions were implemented. Now, what used to happen, guys, was that appointment of civil servants, appointments was based on a system of patronage. The Court of Directors of East India Company enjoyed this privilege called as patronage, using which they could appoint their relatives, nephews, nephews, cousins, etc. as civil servants here in India. Now, while that is not tampered with, Lord Cornwallis says that promotions will not be based on somebody's word, those will be based on only seniority. As you know, we largely continue this very same system in India so that there is no extraneous influence in promotion matters. That is the idea that Lord Cornwallis implemented here. So yes, you can argue on the counter side, then efficient officers do not have incentive. While we can grant that to some extent, but then the larger issue is that there will be corruption, there will be influence, there will be nepotism in promotion matters. And in that sense, Cornwallis was wise to have seniority-based promotions. So now the civil servant is free to discharge his role. He does not have to bend over backwards to please somebody in London. He had to declare also his assets when he left India. This was an interesting step that Lord Cornwallis introduced. The civil servant leaving India had to declare his assets before he left so that one could make out whether he has indulged in any corruption or no. So these were the reforms of Lord Cornwallis, and rightly he is described as the father of civil services in India. Now let us see other major landmarks regarding civil services. Lord Wellesley, the imperialist who comes to India towards the fag end of the century, of the 18th century, he realized that many of these civil servants who are being sent here to India from England, they are barely 18 years old and they do not have any exposure, experience about India. Therefore, to train them, he established the Fort William College in 1800 at Calcutta. This Fort William College was supposed to train these civil servants in Indian languages, among other things, so that these raw young men, boys only rather, barely late teens, they would be better geared up to deal with the challenges of administration. Later on, the Court of Directors did not quite like this idea, and they shifted the training college to East Indian College at a place called as Haileybury in England. This was a decision taken by Court of Directors because they wanted to keep their influence intact. They did not want this very important function discharged here in Calcutta. Okay. Charter Act of 1833 during William Bentinck's time made a very crucial development in regards to civil services. The Charter Act very clearly said that there will be no discrimination on the basis of religion, color, place of birth, creed, etc. when recruiting to the civil services. This was the first time that the Britishers had accepted the principle of removing any form of discrimination and opening up the offices of British government to Indians. This was a landmark in that sense. Now, although its practical implementation could not take place because Court of Directors objected to this, and then Indians were really not given the same equal footing, but nevertheless, at least for the first time, something of this sort was being uttered from the horse's mouth, as they say in English. Macaulay Committee gave its report in 1835. Macaulay, you remember, he was made the fourth member of the Governor General's Council, the law member. He gave a report. He said, only the best and the brightest should be selected as civil servants. Earlier, what used to happen? It was a system of patronage. The Court of Directors used to appoint civil servants. Macaulay says that this is not right. You need to have the best and the brightest only for the civil services. So this will start the thought process on actually opening up the recruitment through open competitive examination. Right now, yes, there will be some systems put in place in England, but that will not be open for all. Subsequently, we'll see that Charter Act of 1853 completely abolished the earlier patronage system. This system was fully abolished, and in its place, open competition is inducted. Now, anybody who fulfilled the eligibility criteria of education, age, could go and appear for this open competitive examination. Indians also technically were allowed to appear for this, but there was a big catch. The catch was that exam was held in London. Not only was the exam held in London, the age criteria was also very low. Furthermore, the exam was based on curriculum of those universities which Indians had not studied that well. So going to England means a lot of expense, staying there, then cultural shock that people got in that process, language, and also the curriculum difference. All of this put a lot of hurdles in the way of Indians from actually appearing and cracking this particular examination. Even if somebody did, like it will happen later, some Indians will crack it still despite all these hurdles, but then these would have to come from very elite sections of the Indian society. Nevertheless, 1853 open competitive exam based system has started. After this, after Charter Act of 1853, constantly Indian political opinion will demand more and more Indianization of civil services. And for the sake of Indianization, there will be a sub-demand that the exam must be held in India only, as in addition to London. So this demand was finally acceded to in the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms of 1919, which accepted this idea that yes, parallelly, the exam will be held in India. And 1922, Allahabad became the first center for this. Now, Allahabad, guys, has a rich history of learning. The University of Allahabad, it was a very famous university. It has churned out some of the best and brightest teachers and students from this particular place, and it has a long legacy of producing civil servants. So it was a center for preparing for the competitive exam, for the civil services examination back then during colonial times. 1926, Public Service Commission was established for the first time here in India, and Sir Ross Baker will be its chairman. For prelims, we must remember this. Government of India Act 1935 enlarged the powers and made this body, Public Service Commission, a Federal Public Service Commission. Government of India Act 1935. So this is the, you can say, precursor of, or you can say, from out of this structure only, Union Public Service Commission has finally evolved. So we understood the evolutionary aspect of civil services. Now let us get to know some basic points regarding the nature of the civil services. what was the kind of work that these people did for the British government? What was its nature like? Now, in terms of nature, we have also already touched upon the discriminatory and exclusionary character of the civil services. The British government consciously wanted to keep out Indians from the civil services. The reason being very apt and logical. These civil servants were supposed to perpetuate the British rule. Their role was to look after the British interest. And therefore, the British government felt that this could be done better by Britishers and not by Indians, who would obviously have sensitivity towards their country, their fellow people. And hence, they were always very circumspect in allowing Indians into these services. It will be only after a lot of effort by the freedom fighters of India that we will see Indians will be inducted in the civil services. 1793, in fact, they had even made a rule that any post with 500 pounds per year and above salary was compulsorily to be recruited by Europeans only. While what was true for civil services was also applicable to army, police, judiciary, etc. All of these branches had these kind of ideas. The rationale, as we just saw, goal is to establish and consolidate British rule in India, and therefore it was British officials who were trusted with this and not Indians. So that is rationale number one. Number two, appointing the civil servants before 1853 was a big privilege. And this privilege the company did not want to lose. The British high society did not want to lose. And that is why they wanted to only have Europeans in these services. The civil services had vast powers and enjoyed a lot of prestige. You have to understand this from the perspective of British Raj, guys. For a common Indian who was living in a distant district, he was never going to come to Calcutta or later say Delhi to look at the way the Raj was run as such. He would never be able to see that grandeur and pomp. And back then you did not have all of these social media platforms whereby you can, watch things happening in a very distant place, of course. So consequently, for the common man, it was the administration at the district which created his view about what the British Raj was like. And therefore, the Britishers were very conscious in projecting the office of the collector, who for the common man was the British Raj. Okay, projecting that office of the district collector as one with a lot of grandeur, with a lot of pomp and show. So the district collector and the superintendent of police, SP, their offices, the kind of pomp and show that was around them, all of that was done to impose a hegemony on the minds of the Indians. This was consciously done by the Britishers. They were called as the steel frame of India. British Prime Minister Lloyd George. Lloyd George, the famous British Prime Minister, he had referred to the Indian civil services in the British Parliament. In the British Parliament, he used these words that is the steel frame of India. And this was in context of, reducing the powers of civil services. Lloyd George vehemently denied that, we will not reduce the powers of civil services. Why? Because that is the steel frame of India, which is holding together the British Raj. Satyendranath Tagore, one fact that we must remember, became the first Indian to crack this examination way back in 1863, and he secured the rank fourth rank in that particular examination. Satyendranath Tagore is brother of Rabindranath Tagore, way elder than him. There were other siblings in between the two. So this is the evolution of the civil services, guys. Similar to civil services, army was also a very crucial instrument. We have to understand, guys, that the British Indian Army is different from the British Army there in Britain. The British Indian Army was, in fact, much bigger than the British Army. Its numbers around revolt of 1857 had swelled around 3 lakhs. So it was a very, very huge army as such. And it is understandable because Britain is a island and consequently, and a small one at that. Consequently, it did not require a very big army as such. Whereas the Indian subcontinent is massive. To rule over the Indian subcontinent, the Britishers required a very big army, and that is what they had built it up here in India. These officers of the British Army, British Indian Army, they were also trained at Sandhurst. Now, what is Sandhurst? Sandhurst is the military academy in Britain where their officers are trained. So you can say it's like the parallel of IMA, Indian Military Academy. In fact, Indian Military Academy was set up later, much later, basically on the same lines as the Sandhurst Academy. So Sandhurst is a very prestigious institution over there, much like what we have in terms of IMA and NDA, OTA, all of these places here in India. So the officers of the British Indian Army, they were also trained at the same place, and then they were attached to the British Indian Army. Apart from these officers who were coming directly from Britain, that is from Sandhurst, there were also what was called as VCOs, Viceroy Commissioned Officers. These were people who had served in India in different ranks and were found to be exceptionally good and competent. Sometimes these were also inducted as officers. So they are coming from below with the help of experience and competence. These were called as VCOs, Viceroy Commissioned Officers. Objective of the army was to guard the empire from external threat and prevent internal revolution. Number 2. Thirdly, in addition to this, defense of empire in Asia and Africa also. So it was the duty, responsibility of the Indian Army, British Indian Army, to not only fight for their interest here, but also in case of distant places of the empire in Asia and Africa as well. And that is why we'll see they will fight in many different theaters. In World War I, almost a million Indians had participated in different roles in World War I exercise. Indian soldiers were employed on big numbers. Relatively, British soldiers were less. Officers, below that soldiers. Officers is largely British, but soldiers, largely Indians. Why? Because British soldiers were more expensive to pay. Indian soldier could do that same work as good as a European soldier, and he had to be paid much less than what a British soldier would have to be paid. But officers, there the British were very conscious. They always kept the officer cadre in the hands of Europeans. Indians could not rise to higher posts in the army, howsoever good they might be, howsoever good. In the initial, part of the British rule, they could not even go beyond the rank of subedars. But later on, in the 20th century, slowly Indians will be allowed to rise higher, but even then, not at commanding officer levels. Why did Indians fight for East India Company and later also for the British Crown? We need to understand the context of that time. Why were Indian troops of East India Company? Basically, it was Indian troops who were fighting. Why are they ready to fight against Mysore, against Marathas, against other Indian powers? Why are they fighting? The reasons were many. Number 1, modern nationalism was not yet developed in India. Modern nationalism. Okay? There is one thing called as cultural nationalism. That's a different idea. We're talking about modern nationalism as it developed in Europe. So in the 18th century, early 19th century, a person living in, say, Awadh, he could not relate with somebody who is living in Maratha areas, and therefore, while fighting in these wars, these soldiers, East India Company soldier coming from Awadh, did not find anything incorrect about fighting the Marathas. Why? Because that modern nationalism was absent. That we Indians are a one single nation. That concept is slowly going to foster. That is reason number 1. Reason number 2, the concept of loyalty to salt, namak. Okay? This is a very integral feature or ethos of Indian civilization. If you have been employed by somebody, if you have drawn salary from somebody, then you are expected to remain loyal to that particular entity. That is the idea of namak. So that concept of namak was understood and used very well by the Britishers. They being the paymasters, they knew this concept of namak or salt can be used to earn the loyalty of Indian troops. Number 2. Number 3, back then, the pay, perk and prestige. The pay, perks and prestige of Company Bahadur, as it was called. Wearing that red coat, okay, having that sharp military bearing and look, a life of discipline, being part of a entity which was winning wars after wars. So all of that brought a lot of pay, perks and prestige with that job, and consequently, many people found that attractive. Furthermore, as the British rule matured, they consciously tried to keep the army isolated from the rest of the society in barracks and cantonments. This was a conscious decision. As you all know very well, in India, we have even today several areas that are called as cantonment areas. This is a legacy from British times. Now the government is taking some big steps regarding cantonment areas. So these cantonment areas were areas where the military community, their families, the soldiers, they could be kept isolated, secluded from the rest of the society, so that the society's trends, values, ideas would not influence the soldiers. So these were some of the steps and measures. I hope you got this, guys. Post revolt of 1857, the Britishers brought a concept of martial races. Martial races. The Pathans, Gurkhas, Sikhs, Punjabis, these were considered as martial races, as in those races who traditionally have been warriors. And they mostly focused their recruitment from these races. The reason had been that these communities had served the Britishers loyally during the revolt of 1857 also. Unlike the Bengal army, which had other communities which were, more politically, you can say, they were influenced by the politics of that day and age. The other martial communities had remained aloof, and for the Britishers, this was a great asset. Therefore, they will recruit the martial races more after the revolt of 1857. So that's about the evolution of army. Now let us quickly see the police. During the Mughal system, guys, policing was carried out by two entities. One was the Fajdar, who with troops used to be posted in different areas, and he was a Mughal official, salaried official. And then there was the traditional elite rural chief called as Zamindar. So these two were the instruments used by the Mughals to maintain law and order. Primary responsibility in that area is that of Zamindar. But what if the Zamindar himself becomes rebellious? He tries to create ruckus, rebels against the Mughal state. Then what will happen? For that reason, there was a check and balance in the form of Fajdar also. I hope you're getting this. When EIC's rule is established, this traditional structure of Mughal times became defunct. As you know, already the Nawab's powers were undermined. EIC had all the powers with it. Consequently, the traditional structure was not functional anymore. Therefore, we see that in the late 1760s and early 70s, there will be a rise in rate of crime and law and order will go for a toss. There will be a lot of dacoities, there will be a lot of looting and plundering that will go on, rebellions, etc., etc. And because of this, Warren Hastings will decide that something needs to be done. We need to have an alternative system. Since the Fajdar is now irrelevant, as the Mughal rule for all practical purposes is over there, Warren Hastings appointed English magistrates to deal with this. These English magistrates were to be supported by the zamindars. And together, just like in tandem over here, we had this system. These two were supposed to work in tandem, zamindars under the English magistrate. But this also failed. And then comes in Lord Cornwallis, and he will implement some very important reforms. Lord Cornwallis, he is called as the father of modern police system in India. Why so? Number one, he understood that the zamindars often is the source of the problem. Therefore, he relieved the zamindars of their traditional policing duties. They don't have to deal anything with police and law and order related stuff now. Districts were divided into thanas, and each thana would have an area of 20 to 30 square miles. Each of these 20, 30 thanas, or whatever the number might be, these thanas will be headed by an official called as daroga. Persian word daroga, that is chief. What we today call as SHO or police inspector, PI. In Maharashtra, referred to as PI. So daroga or SHO type system starts from Lord Cornwallis's times. Now, this daroga was a very powerful official in that particular area. The post was reserved for Europeans back then, and over the period of time, this daroga and the zamindar, they develop a nexus. This daroga zamindar nexus started to exploit the common people. If you have seen old movies of Bollywood, of 70s and 80s, which reflected the feudal systems of rural areas, you'll often see that there will be a big Thakur Sahab in the village. He is the zamindar feudal type of elite who is exploiting the common masses. And when the common masses, they try to reach out to the SHO turns out hand in glove with the zamindar Thakur Sahab. Okay? So this is that same nexus, the village elite and then the state official, they colluding and being hand in glove. Daroga and zamindar nexus became very exploitative in rural areas. During these times, even today, if you go to many parts of North India, the word daroga, it connotes a person with a lot of power. It has become a part of colloquial, sayings, muhavre, as we call it in Hindi also. So that is daroga zamindar nexus. Since this became very exploitative, this was soon abolished in 1812. Later on, Sir Charles Napier, who had annexed Sindh, he developed a new system in Sindh after 1843. This new system was based on Irish constabulary model. Now, the Britishers were maintaining control over the Irish, forceful control over the Irish. And there they had developed some police reforms. That was called as Irish constabulary model. This model was implemented here by Sir Charles Napier and then replicated in other provinces also. Okay. A few more developments. After revolt of 1857, British realized that they were not, sufficiently abreast with such a big thing brewing in those times. Therefore, they realized that we need to improve our policing system and established a police commission. Later, a police act will be passed in 1861 to upgrade the police force. Similarly, during Cornwallis's time, a police commission was established in 1902 as well. All right. So this was about the police related developments. Now let us see improvements or reforms in judiciary. Warren Hastings, as we have seen in his discussion, in his lecture, he first starts out the reforms in judicial system. He established Diwani Adalat and Faujdari Adalat in district level, and then Sadar Diwani and Sadar Nizamat Adalat as courts of appeal. Later on, this system will be stabilized by Lord Cornwallis. Cornwallis will improve upon his ideas. Diwani Adalats therefore came about in every district, which were headed by district judges. Cornwallis separated civil judge and collector. Earlier, collector used to discharge this function also. But Cornwallis said that we need to have separation of power. Collector represents the executive. And if he will head the judiciary as well, then that will lead to a lot of problems. So he separates the two. That is the context of ideas from Enlightenment and French Revolution. Separation of power. To the credit of Cornwallis here. They established a series of courts which were arranged hierarchically. Lowest courts were subordinate courts headed by Indian judges called as Munsifs and Ameens. Above them were registrar courts, then district courts, and then Sadar Diwani Adalat. So this was a gradation of courts for civil cases. For criminal cases, Cornwallis divided the province of Bengal into 4 areas and established four circuit courts. Four circuit courts where appeal could, go. So in this manner, Warren Hastings and Cornwallis, they first tried to structurize the judiciary. Charter Act of 1833 saw the establishment of Law Commission. Lord Macaulay, who was the first law member, headed the Law Commission, and his role was to codify secular law in India. To codify secular law in India. And on that basis, we'll see IPC, CPC, Civil Procedure Code, CRPC, all of these will come about in 1959, 1960, 61. In that period. All of these these codes are going to come about in that period because of this Law Commission. William Bentinck, the reform-minded Governor General, left his impact on judicial services also. He abolished Provincial Court of Appeals. William Bentinck was facing the problem of deficit. When he comes as Governor General of Bengal, he faces the problem of deficit. He has to reduce the company's expenditure in India. He realized that these Provincial Court of Appeals, they are just one step. People in any case go ahead and they have just been draining out resources, time and energy of people. So he stopped these Provincial Court of Appeals, thereby reducing a lot of expense. He raised the status and power of Indians. He was, a very liberal-minded person, had affection for India and Indians and wanted to raise them in terms of status. So we see that in judicial service also. Indians could now be made deputy magistrates as well as principal Sadar Ameens. These were posts in the judicial system. So Lord William Bentinck opened up the appointments in judiciary for Indians, a major reform in his period. 1865, the Supreme Court at Calcutta, Sadar Adalats, that is Sadar Diwani Nizamats, they were merged into three high courts. Three high courts of Calcutta, Bombay and Madras. So this is another major landmark in terms of judiciary. Finally, in 1935, Government of India Act, Federal Court will be created because Government of India Act 1935 will inaugurate the idea of Federation of India, and this will require a court to decide cases between different provinces. If there is a conflict between two provinces, like there is some water issue or there is some other challenge, then the federal court can deal with those issues. Supreme Court of India has inherited this role of, as a federal court as well. So we have understood the landmarks of judiciary, guys. Now let us see some of the nature related aspects. In terms of criminal law, the Britishers initially used Muslim criminal law because that was the legacy of the Mughal period. It was made less harsh because Muslim criminal law has very stringent punishments. Britishers, inspired by ideas of liberty of that day and age, tried to reduce the harshness. Civil law was generally customary law of that specific area. Civil law as in issues related to marriage, divorce, alimony, adoption, inheritance, all of these which we today call as personal issues, they are called as, they fall under civil law, which was based on practices of that particular area. Charter Act of 1833 then gave the Governor General in Council the power to make law. Thus far, these laws were based on religion or customs. Religion or customs. Now, for the first time, with Charter Act of 1833, law making would be done by secular authority, and this secular authority's laws will be obeyed across the country. Thus, rule of law was to be implemented in India. The principle or idea of rule of law was to be implemented instead of rule of men. Not people's whims and fancies, not the ideas of rulers, but rather rule of law will be implemented. This also brings in equality before law. Everybody, irrespective of their status, background, heredity, irrespective of anything, he was equal in the eyes of the law. This principle is also introduced thanks to the reforms in judiciary during British times. But This was not as if it was perfect. There was a hypocrisy in this. Europeans were tried under English law, not the laws in India, and that too in a separate court. So a segregation or distinction was made for Europeans, which militates against these principles. But nevertheless, we have to accept that these modern principles were at least, given lip service over here. There was some sort of application of these principles. Now, the criticism of judicial reforms in India. Emergence of legal inequality. The system as implemented by Britishers created so many hurdles before the common masses that although it aimed to create equality, it ended up creating legal inequality. A poor person, for example, could not afford this expensive judicial system where he had to travel to the courts, he had to engage a lawyer, he had to pay different types of fees, then the cases dragged on for a long time. All of this made things very expensive for the common man. The laws were made in English. They were written in a lawyer's language. Now, howsoever good you are in English, if you were to read, some of these laws, you would naturally find it very difficult to comprehend. They're not written in very simple form. Okay. These days, there has been a demand that all of these laws should be simplified in simple English so that common people can relate to it. The more complications are created, the more law becomes inaccessible and the more you become dependent on legal experts. So that complication was difficult to grasp. Then corruption in police and other departments. Now, to get justice, these departments have to first do their role very well. If the police are not taking FIR, if the police are not doing investigation properly, then what is the use of having a legal system? This entire setup, it is an organic whole. If one or more sides do not perform their role, then judiciary there becomes helpless, because judiciary works on the basis of evidence, not anything else, right? Not on emotions. Time consuming, tortuous, and expensive. Time consuming, it took years, and now you know that on an average a case typically takes 3 to 4 years. That's the average, okay? But then on the upper side, you know that cases have been dragging on for decades also. So this starts during the British times. Tortuous means step-by-step process. There are a lot of stages through which the cases have to go through, which common man finds difficult to understand, and of course expensive. These were the criticisms made out on the judicial system. Now let us quickly see some of the PYQs asked on the areas that we have discussed. The first one, the staple commodities of export by English East India Company from Bengal in middle of the 18th century were. You are given 4 options. A, raw cotton, oilseeds and opium. B, sugar, salt, zinc and lead. C, copper, silver, gold, spices and tea. And D, cotton, silk, saltpeter and opium. Now, we have spoken about this product, saltpeter, which was exported from here in India. It was used in making gunpowder. So this was the right answer option. In any case, you have silk and cotton also over here. So that further reinforces it. Okay. So answer is answer option D. I'm sure you must have been able to get it. Next question. Which of the following statement correctly explains the impact of Industrial Revolution on India during the first half of 19th century? Indian handicrafts were ruined. Machines were introduced in Indian textile industry in large numbers. Railway lines were laid out. Laid out in many parts of the country. Heavy duties were imposed on imports of British manufacture. Now, clearly, all these three are, very visibly wrong statements. What happened was Indian handicrafts were ruined. So that is the answer to this previous year's question, and I'm sure you must have been able to get this also quite easily. Next one. Consider the following about Charter Act of 1813. It ended the trade monopoly of East India Company in India, except for trade in tea and trade with China. So statement number 1 is correct. Now see in the answer option, wherever 1 is not there, that is eliminated straight away. It asserted the sovereignty of British Crown over the Indian territories held by the company, and the revenues of India were now controlled by the British Parliament. Remember, during this entire period, revenues till the Crown takes over, revenues are not being controlled. They want to control the governance, administration, the political aspect. The company is going to be concerned with the revenue. So statement number 3 is for sure wrong. Straight away you're able to eliminate these two answer options and you reach to answer option A, which is the right answer. Okay, so these were a few of the questions that were asked in recent years on the topics that we have discussed. Comprehensively, we have discussed all the areas thus far, and you should be able to confidently take on any questions asked in these topics, guys. I'll see you in my next class tomorrow, where we will further our discussion from around mid-19th century onwards. If you've liked this lecture, then do like this video, leave some love in the comment box and share it with your friends. Thank you very much.